Um, okay, so my name is Esther Quaedackers. I'm a big historian at the University of Amsterdam. I've been teaching and coordinating big history courses there for quite some time. I also have a background in architecture, so I was originally trained as an architect. And my main research focuses on how to connect big history to architecture. Hence the title of my presentation, so the importance of big history for the future of building. And well, that future of building, that was basically also there by request, because the organizers of this webinar really wanted to think about sustainable building, building future cities, topics like that. And in many ways, I think that is a good idea, because we have quite a bit of work to do when it comes to future building. Take, for instance, this projection that you can find on our World in Data, sites like that, that in 2050, cities will need to house 6.7 billion people. And that is actually 2.2 billion more than today. So that's housing, infrastructure, all these kinds of things for 2.2 billion people. And we have 30 years to achieve that. So architects have a lot of work to do, and what they will be very important. It will be very important for all the people living in these cities, but also for all of the life in the cities, for all of the life surrounding the cities, and perhaps for our planet as a whole. So we need to think carefully on how to build these cities, how to build all of this stuff that we need, to ensure that the effects of all of this construction work are as beneficial as possible to all humans, life, and our planet as a whole. That is not easy though, because building, well, that will require resolving all kinds of challenges. For instance, relating to the list that, well, you can see here on this slide, the list that you can get from World Economic Forum or things like that. So these fora that have decided, okay, these are the main problems or the main things that we need to tackle to be able to build all of this new urban infrastructure in the next 30 years. So from the bottom to the top, we have to think about all of the resources that we're going to need to build these cities. We're going to have to think about environmental threats that well, may threaten the cities, but also about ways in which cities can actually lead to new environmental threats. So it's a back and forth relationship. There will be all kinds of new building technologies that will be, well, developed anyway, but perhaps also for specific problems. We have to think about how we're going to deal with the inequality in our world, in our societies, that is already quite large, but might be exacerbated if we build these cities in the wrong way. And we have to think about how we can govern city building, but also about how cities, how new additions to cities will actually affect governance. So all kinds of different processes, complicated processes, also processes that take place at different levels of complexity. That is what is big historian that sees big history as a development in which increasingly complex systems emerge over time, would say. You can also say you have all of these processes that involve materials, that involve living things in general, and that involve human cultures. So challenges involving all kinds of different material, biological, and cultural processes, and thinking about all of these different processes is hard. And it's being made even harder by the fact that all of these processes are intertwined. So you have these different material, biological, cultural processes that all affect each other. And you have to think about those relationships when trying to come up with new plans for future buildings. So how can we think about all of these different processes and their interconnections? Well, I have no all-encompassing answer to that. There are, of course, many ways in which you can actually do this. But one thing to keep in mind while trying to come up with these future processes, trying to come up with how we can actually sort of manage them, to ensure that we create the best environments for ourselves as possible, is that from psychological and neurological research, you can actually get the impression, or you can actually see, that the way we imagine the future is actually very much affected by the way we think about the past. As it turns out, when we think about the past, we use exactly the same brain areas, exactly the same neural circuits as we use when we think about the future. We dream up what we think might happen in the next decades, or even on the longer term. So that means that if you want to think about these intertwined material, biological, cultural processes, then that process is shaped by how you think such processes occurred in the past. So how did material, biological, cultural processes affect each other in the past hundreds, thousands, millions, or even billions of years? And that is, of course, where big history comes in. So the big history part of my title, that refers to this, because big history studies how all kinds of material, biological, and cultural processes have affected each other in the past. How, as a result of 13 billion years of history of atoms, molecules, materials, planets, and the biological history that's actually built on top of that, and is also affects material history, how the history of life and subsequently the cultural history that is built on that and affects everything that came before and is below, how that together shapes our world. So that is, of course, why you can see in this picture, you can see the different layers, but the lines between the layers are dashed. There are always lots of interactions going on there. And that is what big historians try to find out. That's a lot of fun, because you can explore all things that, well, not too many people have been looking at before. This also means that you can, when you think about processes affecting building, you can also see them as a part of these historical layers. So material resources, building resources, they also have a history that is part of the material layer of big history. You can think about building technologies that have, of course, been developed by humans, but also all kinds of other life forms, as Nobuo has already pointed out. You can see that, so the history of these building technologies, as part of a biological historical layer of big history. And you can see, for instance, the history of building governments as part of that cultural layer of big history. So you can already see out of that list that you can find as composed by the World Economic Forum, out of that list, I just picked 3 components and I put them in this big history scheme that has a certain arbitrariness to them. You can put all kinds of other processes that are important for building in such a big history framework as well. But for this presentation, I'm just going to use those as they are deemed important by, well, quite a large group of influential people. And what I want to show you next is how you can use big history to think about how these different processes, so the history of building resources, of building technologies and building governance, how by using a big history perspective, you can actually think about them as having been intertwined. I'm going to give you a very brief summary of that, because we don't have that much time in this type of seminar. But I hope that my summary will give you a kind of impression of how you can think about these processes in the context of big history. So you can, for instance, think about material history, right? And you can think about how our planet came to be filled with rocks and all kinds of plant materials that life, so all kinds of animals, including humans, have subsequently started to use for building. So that is sort of a regular component of big history, but it also raises a couple of very interesting questions, because when you think about that, what has actually become available on our planet, so these rocky materials and these plant materials, mostly these woody materials, they are actually not entirely ideal to build with. And the reasons for that are actually quite simple. You can also see them on this, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. Probably not, but you can see in the top, you can see that, okay, rocky materials, depending on their size, can be quite heavy. So that makes it difficult to build with them. If they're too small, they're actually easy to move around, but they can be quite crumbly, which also leads to all kinds of complications. Say you can find suitably sized building materials, rocky materials, and it can be really difficult to piece them together, as you can see, as has been done by this caddisfly larvae. And it actually spent a lot of time puzzling all of these little sand grains together. And if you don't want to puzzle them together, you need to cut out decent chunks of rocky materials. But as you can see in this marble quarry, that also requires a lot of effort. Building with wood involves all kinds of different challenges. So wood is not too heavy, but it's too light sometimes. So it can be, well, damaged by wind or water currents, like a nest that falls out of the tree. And it also decays fairly rapidly, so it rots. Also not that convenient. So the good news is on our planet, we have stuff to build with. It's just not ideal per se. Fortunately, when you move to that next layer, that history of life layer, you can see that as a result of evolution, life is just so creative. So it invented solutions for lots of things, and it also invented solutions to this problem of building being expensive in terms of resources. For instance, as you can see in this image of a paper wasp nest, it came up with all kinds of ideas to sort of minimize these resource costs. You can see, yeah, well, not in this picture actually, but usually these paper wasps nests are very cleverly attached to wherever they are. You can also see that, I mean, you have these woody materials that are used for the basis of these nests, but wasps chew them up into kind of pulp and mix them with saliva. And that saliva is actually, that actually ensures that the paper is resistant to moisture and decay, so it doesn't rot that easily. And you can also see that material has been used very efficiently by creating all of these hexagonal cells. So that minimizes material need. So that's very clever. And you can survey the history of animal building and find these very clever tricks everywhere. So that's one type of strategy to deal with these resource costs. But there's another strategy, and that can be seen in the bottom picture here. That's a bowerbird's nest. And bowerbirds, and also a couple of other animals, they don't try to minimize the energy cost at all. They maximize them. They spend as much energy, as much resources on building as they can in order to show potential mates that they have enough energy. So they want to stand out from their peers. They want to show their peers, or actually not their peers, but the mates, that they're different. And yeah, that's a different way, I guess, of dealing with these resource needs, but also a clever one. And then when you build on that further and you venture into cultural history, so from the evolution of humans basically up to today, then what you can actually see that for all kinds of evolutionary reasons, humans have become the only animal that combines these two very different strategies. Yeah, so we maximize the cost of building, the resource cost of building, and try to minimize them at the same time. It's very paradoxical, but humans find ways, sometimes spontaneously, but quite often combining these very different strategies is also regulated. So with the aid of building governance. And that is actually what you can see in these pictures. So you can see a fairly recent edition of the Chinese building manual, the Yingxiao Fashe. I probably didn't pronounce that correctly, Shanshan, you can correct me later. So it's a building manual from around 1100 CE. And what that actually does is it prescribes in great detail how people can sort of differentiate, distinguish themselves with the aid of building without going too far. So it's very clever. It contains all kinds of prescriptions about how large halls and other types of structures for certain classes of humans can be. It contains all kinds of prescriptions on how they can be decorated. So the types of brackets and the ornamental or the elaborateness of the brackets used, the types of materials that could be used, the types of colors that could be used, and so on and so on. There's way too much there to describe here. And I hope that Shanshan will be doing so later anyway. So I won't go into that much detail here. But the general point is that in several instances throughout the history of humanity, you see that these different strategies that emerged out of biological evolution based on the history of our material world, that they can be combined in quite interesting ways that allow people to stand out as part of their group. They acknowledge that need, or so it seems, but they also restrict people. So as a group, they cannot spend too many resources on building, but the types of governance do allow for differentiation. And that seems to be important for people to stand out as part of their group. And note that I'm saying standing out as part of their group, not just from their group, because I don't think it's a matter of, oh, I'm just different or I'm something else as my group, but you want to be in a group, but just as a specific individual. I mean, Nobu showed us the ants and the termites. There, that's not a big problem, being just a part of a group, because those animals are obviously eusocial, but we're not eusocial. We're our own individual, but we do live in these huge colonies of millions, billions of people. And okay, that causes these kinds of interesting situations as I'm describing here.
Esther, you have about 4 minutes left.
Okay, that's perfect, because I'm almost at the end. This was just an example of how we can contextualize a couple of these challenges identified by the World Economic Forum with the aid of a big history framework. It's a particular example, so you can come up with many different versions of this. But my point is that thinking about the past of building in this big history kind of way, in this way in which you can see how material, biological, cultural processes have become intertwined throughout big history, that may help you imagine the future in slightly different ways. So I mean, I haven't done an architectural study on this or anything like that. It's just that I've been thinking about a couple of the conclusions or ideas that might come out of this kind of thinking for this webinar. What strikes me most is that this story makes me think about our ability to develop these governance strategies that encourages the development of these new building technologies, that both acknowledge that people use resources on building to stand out as part of their group. But in the context of sustainability, we also need to restrict that, of course, because we cannot just spend resources on building. We don't have them. We're running out of them. So that running out of them and not using resources on building or using resources in the most efficient way, that is widely acknowledged, of course, in the architectural world. But acknowledging that people also, as a sort of a very deep historical need, want to stand out through their buildings, that is something that is often neglected. And I think that is something you can take away from this kind of thinking. And that could lead to all kinds of ideas about how you could perhaps design future cities. And these are just a few. You could, for instance, think about encouraging people to try to stand out by being the most sustainable. That is a very obvious one. And actually that is already happening in many ways, right? It's good to be sustainable. It gives you a certain status. But you can come up with all kinds of different things. Perhaps you could think about individualized movable tiny homes that belong to people so they can completely design in their own way to represent their own identity and never have to get rid of, can always take with them. But in the context of a city, you could perhaps stack them in some kind of high-rise tower-like way. Or you could think about blocks, just dwelling blocks that are sometimes a little monotonous, at least where I'm from. You could perhaps think about building these blocks with these durable rocky materials, but then make these wooden facades that people can easily adapt. So you can get sort of a collage overall facade that forms a whole, but where different parts of the building that belong to different people have a slightly different appeal. Or you can think about public spaces, common spaces that are created everywhere, of course, in these cities. But what's often lacking is an idea of how individual people actually relate to those. And well, I think I've run out of time. So that's it. These are just a few ideas. There are many more. I hope this kind of thinking can serve as an inspiration, just a tiny bit at least, for building these future cities, because we need the cities and there's a lot of work to do. So lots of ideas needed. Done.